Hello everybody, this is Erin Ekins of Clearly Autistic.
Thank you very much, Emma. And thank you for having me again at Autistic Pride. I just want to second everything Dean was saying about how important Autistic Pride is in a increasingly hostile world. It's so important to have events where we have pride. A few weeks ago, I had the immense joy and pleasure of kind of being with AIM at London Pride, so bringing together that Autistic Pride and that Queer Pride, which I believe really kind of go together in so many ways, because so many of us live under that intersection of being queer, trans, LGBTQ+, and autistic, and that is the area that I'd like to focus on speaking about today. I myself am queer, I'm autistic, and I've written 2 books to help young queer, trans and questioning autistic people. One of them came out a few years ago, and the last one came out just this year. And the reason that I wanted to write these books is really, really simple, and that's I am a queer autistic adult, and I was once a queer autistic teenager. Regardless of what the tabloids try to tell you, that is how the passage of time works. Queer adults were indeed once queer children. Autistic adults were indeed once autistic children. And I experienced the frustration, the confusion, the isolation, might even potentially go as far to say trauma, of growing up as a queer autistic person without that targeted support and understanding that I desperately needed. And I'm determined, as I know many others are, not to let that happen to anyone else. We know that autistic people are overwhelmingly likely to identify as some flavour of LGBTQ+ than non-autistic people, whether that's queer, whether that's trans, questioning, or unlabelled, or any fabulous label that exists and feels right for that person. To the point where there's so many of us that we have a name for it, which is one of my favourite kind of names, which is the double rainbow. Now, the rainbow itself is the kind of the symbol of LGBTQ+ pride. You've probably, there's some up over there, and you've seen it everywhere, particularly in Brighton. Today, it was designed in the 70s for kind of that first gay pride march, and it's been the symbol ever since. And the word spectrum, which we use to describe kind of the vast array of autistic people and experiences, is also a scientific term that describes the rainbow of colours that's visible kind of in light. So 2 lots of rainbow, you're queer and autistic, it's the double rainbow. One of my favourite coming together of languages that I've ever come across. And those of us who exist under that double rainbow deserve support for all aspects of who we are. So how do we know that autistic people are more likely to identify as LGBTQ+? Well, we, as autistic people, we've been saying it for years. We never stop blathering on about it. But, of course, no one bothers to listen to us until the researchers get involved. That is, unfortunately, how it works. And that has thankfully started to happen in the past few years. A survey of over 11,000 people back in 2022, which was actually an autistic-led survey. Over 7,000 of people who responded were autistic, and nearly 56% of autistic people who responded identified as LGBT+. 64% identified their sexuality as something other than straight, and nearly 19% identified as trans. Now, this is contrasted to roughly, on kind of the most recent census, 3.7% of the general population that identifies as lesbian, gay or bisexual. Unfortunately, the census has not evolved enough to identify anything other than those few options. And there's an estimated 1% of the population identifying as something other than cisgender. In 2021, moving on to the research that people listen to because the big important researchers did it, Cambridge University's Autism Research Centre released a new study into kind of sexual behaviours of autistic people. There were over 1,100 autistic people were surveyed as part of this, and they found that autistic males, their wording, not mine, not the wording I would have used, but autistic males are 3.5 times more likely to identify themselves as bisexual than non-autistic males. Autistic females are 3 times more likely to identify as homosexual in comparison to non-autistic females, and autistic people generally are 8 times more likely to identify as asexual or other sexuality, because obviously if you don't identify as gay, lesbian or bisexual, you are in the amorphous blob of other sexuality. Similarly, in Cambridge University, a study in 2020 brought together lots of different data sets from all across the research space to bring together the first really comprehensive study into autism and gender identity and being trans, and they found that autistic people are 6 times more likely than non-autistic people to not identify with the sex they were assigned at birth. So that's the research. The researchers are involved. We can pay attention to it now. And they, surprisingly, who would have ever guessed, back up what we've been saying forever, which is, yes, autistic people are more likely than non-autistic people to identify as some flavour of LGBTQ+. Now, why this is, nobody's been able to definitively pinpoint, but my goodness, some of them are really trying to find a reason why this is. And in fact, a lot of the research that I looked into when I was writing my books to find these numbers was really quite insulting in some of the conclusions that they tried to reach about why this was happening. And it was clear they hadn't actually engaged with any autistic people or any LGBTQ+ people in any meaningful way with some of the language they were using. For example, that Cambridge study from 2021 I mentioned, they failed to take into account any diversity of gender identity. They only took into account sex assigned at birth. So that colours their findings quite a lot, because they were split into male and female rather than, gender identity, which means that autistic females could have included some trans men who don't identify as homosexual but may identify as straight. So not being inclusive really colours some of those numbers. Not just that, but a lot of the research that goes into this has really inherent biases, and it's really uncomfortable to read. One study that I had the absolute misfortune of stumbling onto when I was writing my book, and then had to immediately go and lie face down in a dark room for a few hours, otherwise I was going to, start punching walls, decided to claim in their conclusion that yes, they had found that autistic people were more likely to identify as some flavour of LGBT. However, they argued that a large proportion of the autistic people who identified as queer hadn't had a same-sex relationship, and that meant that they couldn't possibly actually be queer. And then their second conclusion was, yes, all these autistic men are claiming to be non-straight, but have you considered that they are just afraid of women? That was a scientific conclusion that the wonderful researchers decided to write down in their official paper. So, ultimately, a load of this research was about, why are you here? Why do you exist? You're queer and autistic. Why are these two things? Why do they exist together? And I really don't care. I don't care why I'm autistic. I don't care why I'm queer. I just know that I am. And the fact that I am is more important than the why. I don't need to know why. I need accommodations, I need resources, and I need respect and support. So whatever the reason that there's many, many more of us out there, I know that there are so many young people like me growing up and trying to figure this stuff out. And that's why it was so important to to write my books and to speak about the things that I speak about today. To actually put something together aimed at autistic people speaking in a way we can understand, to navigate these topics in a healthy and supported way. For me, figuring out my sexuality and finding my space in the queer community came almost entirely from media, from fandom, from the internet, from social media. As a 16-year-old, an incredibly lonely and ostracised 16-year-old, I tuned into the admittedly quite rubbish Doctor Who spin-off Torchwood, and I watched a character like Yanto Jones, whose death we shall never forgive the BBC for that. I watched him be with a woman, and then I watched him be with a man, and I went, oh, that is a thing you can do. Oh, and then I delved into Torchwood fandom, And I found myself in this little fan community of queer nerds who'd been through what I was going through and started giving me the language I could use to talk about myself. And I started writing fan fiction about these characters, a way to explore my own feelings, but safely, through a character I loved, through fiction. I've since come to understand this is really common for autistic people when it comes to figuring out things like gender and sexuality, through fictional characters, through media, through fandom, through fan fiction. And yet I so rarely saw it talked about in major guidance or advice for LGBTQ+ people. Why wasn't this covered? Figuring out your feelings and what they mean through exploring fictional characters is something that I know so many people have done. And it's because a lot of that guidance is not written with autistic people in mind. And in fact, there was a load of advice that I saw for young LGBTQ+ people that wouldn't have been helpful for me or wasn't clear enough for me. For example, everyone assumed that when they said, the definition of being gay is you are attracted to someone of the same sex. There was this assumption, I know what that feels like, I'll be able to identify that, job done, lesson learned. But I needed more information than that. I was like, what do you mean attracted to? What does this feel like? Please help me explain and understand what I'm feeling. So writing the book was really revolutionary for me because it gave me space to actually put down in detail some of these things and what they feel like physically and emotionally, how to recognise them, how to figure them out, because no one had ever told me that when I was a kid. And they assumed that I would just know, and they were wrong. So if you're autistic, your relationship to your gender and your sexuality can be uniquely wonderful and confusing and messy and fabulous and every word you can think of. And the more the world looks at the diversity of how we love and how we identify, it also needs to consider into that the diversity of our minds and how we think and how we consume and perceive the world, and celebrate that all these spectacularly different neurodivergent brains exist within the queer and trans community. And more than anything, I wanted to give young autistic people the confidence to try things safely and securely, and to take the journey that they needed in a way that was safe, supported, and being empowered with the knowledge that they needed. And that's why I'm so passionate about defending the right of young autistic people to access inclusive information. And I know that that's currently under attack. The day after my second book was published earlier this year, I was reached out to by an organisation called the Index on Censorship, which tracks things like censorship of books. And they let me know that Queerly Autistic, my book, had been specifically targeted in a mass book banning at a school in Manchester. 200 books had been banned. A lot of them they think had been selected using AI, because why wouldn't these two evils be together? But Queerly Autistic had been specifically singled out by the school, specifically flagged as this book is inappropriate. We've looked at it, we don't want it in our library. And they had taken action against the autistic librarian who insisted on having it in the library. It was deemed inappropriate for teenagers because it gave detailed, understandable LGBTQ+ inclusive information on sex and relationships specifically aimed at young autistic people. And this was apparently beyond the pale for this particular school. They didn't want these teenagers having access to that information. And I know they're not the only ones. I know for this one that I know about, there are so many schools, so many libraries that will have banned my book, and I don't know about it. And that makes me furious, because I think it's vital that autistic teenagers have good and inclusive access to information on gender, on sexuality, on relationships, and yes, on sex as well. So many autistic people do not get the same advice and support when it comes to sex and relationships, particularly around being queer, because we are desexualised. We are infantilised by society, and this lack of information and education leaves us vulnerable to abuse and to exploring things in ways that aren't safe. If it's not provided in a clear and a safe way, how can they be prepared for a world where they will experience these things? Knowledge is power. It's a cliche, but it's true. Knowledge is power. It's empowering. And denying autistic young people this kind of knowledge is disempowering, and that leaves them vulnerable. If we don't provide space and we don't provide information and the right advice to figure out things safely, then they will be left to do it unsafely. And I think autistic young people deserve better than that. Now, when I grew up during Section 28, which meant that when I was in primary school particularly, it was repealed when I started secondary school, but the culture of Section 28 followed me through my secondary school years. This forbade schools and public bodies from talking about being LGBT with children and teenagers. It was just something that they weren't allowed to do. And not being taught about it, funnily enough, you might have noticed, did not stop me being queer. But it sure as hell stopped me from being able to figure it out as early as I would have liked, or to understand and accept myself in a way that I definitely deserved. And when I look at where we are now, I see us moving back to that. And I refuse to let us slide back that way. I'll put everything out there to stop that from happening. It's never felt more important than right now to be having these conversations about autism, about gender, about sexuality. Because for all the progress we've made, we're existing in really difficult times. Whilst in many ways it is easier and more accepting, we are starting to see really quite violent and hard pushback on the progress that we've fought so hard for. There's this growing hostility, both in society and unfortunately in politics as well, towards LGBTQIA+ people and towards neurodivergent people. And there's particular cruelty currently being named at trans people. So in the face of this, it's so important that people stand up. It's important that we continue to yell and tell the world, hey, we're here, at things like Pride, shouting our queer autistic joy, and showing young people that they have support, love and space to be themselves. The driving force of everything I do, ever since I started talking publicly about this and about living under the double rainbow, has been the belief that we owe it to the generations after us to make sure they have a better experience than we did. I'm still committed to that. And I know that despite everything going on in the world around us, we collectively still have the power to make that a reality. Thank you.